What happened is Vatican II occurred in 1962 to 1965, I believe. And then after Vatican II, with all the new documents, declarations, constitutions, the Catholic Church charged all the local churches or local regions to take and apply Vatican II theology to their particular context. So Karl Rahner wrote a book about maybe some of the German entailments of this. He wrote a book called The Shape of the Church to Come, which is a fascinating book, and it really discloses his kind of idea of church authority and kind of a modernist revelation. But for the Central Latin America context, there was a conference held in Medellin, which is a city in Colombia, very well known because a cartel started there, the Medellin cartel. Pablo Escobar's cartel was in Medellin. So that's how I always remember after watching Narcos. But you see that this conference was held, and then they sought to apply Vatican II theology for their context. And in large measure, they were trying to deal with the issue of the complete disparity between the prosperous and those in power and the average person in the pews and the average person in the country. And so they rejected, eventually Gutierrez developed a theology that began to reject the status quo and this idea of development by, economic development and whatnot, because it was perpetually keeping the poor and underprivileged in, a condition of oppression and whatnot. And so he kind of wedded Vatican II theology to a Marxist philosophy and developed what's called liberation theology. And that has since been used in a variety of different contexts, whether that be in certain subgenres of African-American theology and whatnot, have developed a theology of liberation as liberation from racial injustice and whatnot. And so there's some helpful things to read in terms of Gutierrez to help to understand how they understand the Bible and the relationship between God's justice and what they see as political and social injustice. So one thing that he develops in the book I thought was really fascinating, especially for someone who's read a lot of Karl Rahner, is the idea of love of God and love of neighbor and how those two are connected. So for Rahner, love of God and love of neighbor are effectively the same thing. So to love God, you must love your neighbor. He thinks of the two great commandments. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength, and love your neighbor as yourself. But he doesn't want to think of those as two disconnected things or things done in two different arenas, because loving neighbor is a form of loving God because he's commanded us to do that. There's a whole host of reasons that Rahner understands this. There are a lot of existentialist reasons and kind of Heideggerian ontology behind his reason for understanding this. But at least on a formal level, we could say that love of God and love of neighbor are not discrete, separate, disjuncted activities. So we can agree at a formal level that that's all right. But what's interesting is that Gutierrez takes this and says not only is love of neighbor, love of God, and love of God, love of neighbor, that is, to love God, we must love our neighbor. But he seems to suggest and demonstrate that love of neighbor, and therefore also love of God, must be mediated through particular socio-cultural and socio-political institutions. And so to love your neighbor is not necessarily a matter of personal, private conscience, that you must love your neighbor in a way that accords with God's prompting in your life and according to your conscience, but you have to love your neighbor in a particularly Marxist way,